Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Olivia Ezeobi, as you can see on the board. I'm also from University of Stellenbosch, the Department of Economics. Mainly, I'm a lecturer, though. I do research as well, but that's not my primary function. So I'm a lecturer. I'm passionate about teaching. I am also very interested in the economics of education. That's why I'm part of the FAST team. Interested in educational outcomes, increasing or improving education quality in South Africa, etc. Specifically as a means out of poverty and the links between education and poverty. So my session is, well, in economics we talk about normative and positive economics. So normative economics would be where there's judgment calls, there's room for debate, etc. What's right, what's wrong. Positive more to do with facts. So my session is very much a positive issue. It's about the indicators that are used, how do they measure it. There's hardly any room really for normative or discussion, but that might come in when we talk about limitations. And that is where I'm going to ask you for your inputs, given that you are the experts in education. I'm an economist, interested in education, but you are, the education experts. So specifically, I'm looking at UNESCO Education Indicators, kind of to give an idea as to international standards, what is used around the world, what are the type of things they're looking at, and then I'm also going to briefly speak about education indicators used by the African Union. So the first step we're going to do is looking at where, what, and why. Just a very brief background as to what are we actually talking about before we actually get into the indicators. You'll notice the manual is not the manual, the notes quite a bit. We're not actually going to get through all of them. I'm not going to discuss all of them in detail, but I will be touching in detail on some of them. So the two main sources for what I'm presenting today, there are two documents, or two what you would call indicator manuals, and both of them are going to be made available to you on a memory stick or flash drive, and it's these two on the board. So it's the UNESCO Institute of Statistics Education Indicators and Technical Guidelines book. That's about 50 pages. And then we've also got the ADA, or AD, Association for the Development of Education in Africa, their African Union Indicators. The second one, though, what I'm going to do is, I'm only going to speak about a few of them. Because there is some overlap between the two, but you find that the AU will have things, for example, that are very specific to Africa. And so they might not be included in the UNESCO ones. And there might be things in UNESCO that not maybe so important or such a pressing issue within the African context. So as I said, there are electronic copies available to you. And one of the reasons we make it electronically available to you is because having something electronically in this day and age, it's so much better than having a hard copy. You lose the hard copy, you don't know where it is, or you're at home and you want to check something and it's at the office. Whereas with your iPad and your laptop, if ever you want to check something, doesn't matter where you are, you can just check it. And that's kind of the argument behind it, and also saving the environment, not printing hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents. So just some background on the AU manual indicators. Why did they start this manual, or why did they create this manual? It was part of a bigger capacity building objective for Ministry of Education across Africa. So there was a need identified that we needed to measure indicators more, and there needed to be some sort of consistency across countries. So that was one of the arguments behind it. I mean, we talk a lot about indicators, but why are indicators so important? And are we just saying we need indicators in education? No, we have economic indicators as well, like unemployment rate, inequality, etc. And to use an analogy I like to use would be medical indicators, or looking at your health. When you go to the doctor, the doctor's not just going to believe you when you say, no, I'm in very good health. He's going to test your blood pressure, he's going to test she's going to test your blood sugar levels, etc. Because they want to see what is it, the measurement issue, and then also the diagnosis issue. So what is your blood pressure? Is it high? Is it low? And also degree is important. And that is what we want to do with education indicators as well, to see how are we doing. Comparably, are we healthy? Is the education system healthy? If not, how bad is the intervention, or how strong an intervention do we actually need? And then who is this aimed at? Well, all of us in this room, statisticians, very importantly education managers, which most of you are, and some of you are researchers and planners. So this type of information is aimed at all of you. And like I said, with the African Union, or the Association for Development of Education in South Africa, they have recognized this as a priority. Countries having these indicators, or at least knowledge of these indicators as well. And where there are countries where these indicators have not been piloted or the information isn't there yet, there's an urgent need for us to get this information. So what are education indicators? So I've used one definition. I know Martin spoke this morning about time series and figures and numbers, but I've used what I thought is a nice definition, an individual or composite statistic that relates to a basic construct in education and is useful in a policy context. That's very important because we don't want numbers that we can't use. We want something that can be useful in a policy context. And what's very important with education indicators or any indicator is that we want to use it for comparative purposes. And there's two types of comparisons we want to do. We want to compare over time. So we want to know, have things improved since 1990? Has this indicator changed? Has it become worse? And then we also want to compare between regions. Because we know, for example, in most countries, and likewise in South Africa, we don't have the same performance across different provinces. And even within a province, we have different levels of performance in different towns or districts. So what then are the essential functions? There's two of them. The one is to be a technical instrument. So it's a tool. Again, think about that medical analogy. You want to measure and you want to diagnose. So you want to measure, you get the measurement, and then you can make a judgment, or you can see we're doing well, we're not doing well. And then very, very important, and this is something we really, well, both are important, but what I want to not focus on, but really emphasize is that it's also a tool designed to facilitate communication between different stakeholders, specifically participants in civil society. So this morning, Safar spoke a bit about parents and principal agent problems. So we want to be able to report back to parents and say, this is the information we have, etc., reporting back to the state. So we cannot communicate to different stakeholders if we don't actually have the indicators. So we need the indicators first, we need the data, we need those indicators, and then we can actually facilitate communication between various stakeholders in the country. So what are the different, let's say classifications, not classifications, but what are the most commonly used indicators pertain to? Well, you've got one related to access. We spoke quite a bit about that this morning. Participation or coverage. Efficiency, very important. Looking at flows, also looking at results, etc. Financing, and there are a few about financing in your booklets, although I'm not actually going to go into detail about that. I mean, quality, very important issue in South Africa, anywhere really, but also in our country, given that we spend a lot of money on education, so why are we not seeing the type of returns we hope to see? And then parity, issues like gender parity. Okay. This is just a bit of repetition. Again, why is it important? We want to have a target or kind of like a standard to measure our progress against. It's a vital management tool, so all the managers over here, you need information to work on. You need these indicators. And then, also important, what you want to do is you want to see if your interventions have made a difference. So let's say you send teachers on training. So now you might use an indicator like, let's say pass rates, or has academic outcomes improved after we had this training. So one of the other reasons, or the things that make an educational indicator so important, is that we can use it to see if there's been change after there's been a specific input. An example here, teacher training. So what are the indicators? Like I said, there's a number in the booklet. We're not going to be able to go through all of them, but I do want to speak a bit about some of them. And I'm also going to ask your input, and I'll explain in a minute where I'm looking for input, or just your views as well. So for every single indicator in the UNESCO Indicator Handbook, they've got information, and they classify it, or they give information on the definition, the purpose, calculation, formula, data sources, data required, what type of disaggregation can you use, interpretation, quality standards. I'm not really going to talk about quality standards, although it is in the actual manual. And then limitations. And that is where I'm looking for input from you. We'll give you, this is the indicator that's used by UNESCO, used by countries throughout the world. But what are the limitations? We mentioned some limitations here. I'll give you the limitations that UNESCO refers to. But what I want from you is, what further limitations do you see within the South African context? Or even in practice, what do you see as limitations? So the first one is adult literacy. It is one that we're all familiar with. And like I said, so what is adult literacy? How do they define it? And again, why is it important? I mean, we all know what literacy is, but why do we need to know what the actual definition is? We need to know this so that if we do cross-country comparisons, or if we do comparisons in any situation, we want to be sure that we're comparing apples with apples and not apples with pears. And so it's important that the definitions are the same. So adult literacy looks at the percentage of the population aged 15 years or older who can both read and write with understanding a short, simple statement on his or her everyday life. And numeracy is normally associated with this. They assume a level of numeracy as well. So I want to just go back to something one of the participants said earlier. The gentleman in the red, I've forgotten your name, sorry? Ronald. So I think this morning you spoke about getting population data from Statistics South Africa, etc. So a lot of these, not a lot, quite a few of these indicators, you need information or data from within the Ministry of Education, but you also need from stats data, census data. So you cannot calculate it. For example, this one, in fact, the data source is entirely from Statistics South Africa and not from education. It's adult literacy data, and so you need to get this information from census data usually. And of course, the purpose is self-explanatory. We want to see what are the cumulative, or over time, what have been the achievements of our primary or basic or literacy programs. And very important, literacy represents a kind of like a foundation or potential for further intellectual growth. We're not going to have, if you have a high literacy rate or a high or low literacy, a low adult literacy rate, then obviously we're not going to have, there's not that much potential for human capital growth in South Africa. So like I said, with each of these indicators there are limitations. So some of the limitations with adult literacy and with youth literacy as well, which we'll discuss in a minute, is that some countries apply definitions and criteria which are different to international standards. So you can't make a comparison then. You can't say we are doing better maybe than Botswana in adult literacy if Botswana and South Africa are not using the exact same criteria. And then this that's also common is that some countries, or when they collect information, will equate no schooling with illiteracy. But you can find somebody who's had no formal schooling who is literate. So it's not the same thing, of course. And then this can happen anyway, changing definitions between census. So if we're changing definitions by the next census, then how can we compare to see if we've actually improved over the last few years or not? And then a big deal with literacy, adult literacy, and youth literacy is or are errors in literacy self-declaration. Because you're finding when you do the census, you're asking the person if they're literate or not, and you could get different, that can affect the reliability. So I'd like to just open the floor briefly, like what other limitations, although some of you have mentioned already a few, what other limitations are there with adult literacy within the South African context? I'm talking about collecting information or even just recording information. Nothing? Okay, we'll move on for now. Yes?
Yeah, you're talking about the age group between 15 and 19. And in South Africa, between 15 and 18 are still at school. So I'm not sure whether, that group is counted.
In adult literacy, yes, they are actually. Do you mean those who are at school?
Yeah.
Yes, they are counted as part of, yes. For this particular indicator. We do recognize they're not adults, but we want to compare. The reason it's important is we want to know how are our 15-year-olds or our 16-year-olds functionally literate. If you want to compare it to another, and actually, sadly, you do find that there is a degree of functional illiteracy even within this age group. People who are at school, I'm not really sure how they're making it from grade to grade, but you do see a small degree of that. So, but I take your point about, so basically your argument would be that adult literacy should only be from 18 onwards and not 15. We shouldn't count it from 15 onwards.
Olivia, if I may just add one further limitation, is, as you point out, much of this is self-declared. So if you ask people, are you literate, can you read, very many may say yes, simply because they don't want to admit that they are functionally illiterate. So that, and not all countries deal with this in the same way. So some countries would actually ask you to read it, and that would be what is reflected in their data. In our data, it's simply people are asked whether they can read something. They're not asked to read something. So we may be, our estimates would be exaggerated in terms of literacy.
And especially when you take into account that if a census is done, the survey or the person collecting with the fieldwork is not speaking to everyone in the household. They could be speaking to one person in the household, and then again you have this error in...
And of course there's another complication, and that is, what do you mean when you say somebody can read in what language? Language is not yet entered into it, but some people may say they're not literate because they think you need to read in English, for instance. Okay.
And that's an important point that you mentioned, that yes, the UNESCO is a good guideline, but we need to adapt it within the African context as well. So the youth literacy rate closely related to the adult literacy rate, looking for the same type of information, but now only looking 15 to 24. And of course the reason they're doing this is this has the policy implications are just hugely different for this particular age group. And it's really, you would almost say, it's an indictment on the current education system if the youth literacy is low. Okay. But again, the formula is going to be similar, except with just the age group. So we're talking about the number between 15 and 24 who are literate and numerate, divided by the population group in that particular age group. And I didn't really speak much, and I did speak about the data sources. Again, you're looking at population data. So again, this is kind of out of your hands. Although it's your responsibility to fix it, you're not the ones who are collecting the information. It's actually coming from another source, so that could be a challenge. Disaggregation, again, you can disaggregate by gender, location, urban, rural, etc. So with these, all these indicators, they talk about interpretation. What does it mean? What are we looking for actually? And although I'm not going to go into interpretation with every single indicator, I did want to mention a bit about the youth literacy rate specifically, because it's very important in terms of national human resources policy, looking towards the future, and also forecasting progress in adult literacy. I don't know if anybody wants to comment maybe why else the youth literacy, why we have the separate indicator for youth literacy specifically. So we're also looking at how effective has our primary school been, our primary education been now recently. And I think this is specifically important in South Africa because we know the historical reasons for perhaps high illiteracy in older people, but really what are the reasons for the justification now? Limitations similar to adult literacy.